Good evening and welcome to a special Arts Extra with me, Marie-Louise Kerr. The writer John McGahern was born in Dublin in 1934, but grew up and has spent most of his life in the borderlands of County Leitrim. The eldest of 7 children, his father Frank was a Garda sergeant, his mother Susan was a school teacher. In an unusual family arrangement, his father lived in the police barracks about 20 miles from the family home. He would visit them only on his days off, a day or two every month. This all changed when McGahern's mother died of cancer in her early 40s and the children were taken to live with their father. McGahern returned to his birthplace of Dublin in the 1950s to train as a teacher at St Patrick's Teacher Training College. He worked as a primary school teacher from 1955 until the mid-1960s. It was while he was teaching that McGahern's first novel, The Barracks, was published in 1963. It was followed 2 years later by The Dark, and it was this book that became the subject of huge controversy in Ireland and was banned by the censorship board for its supposedly pornographic content. McGahern lost his teaching job and left Ireland. After time spent in London and Paris, he returned in the early 1970s. Also well known for his short story writing, McGahern has published 4 more novels: The Leave-Taking, The Pornographer, Amongst Women, and That They May Face the Rising Sun. Most recently, he's written his autobiography. We travelled to his home in Mohill, County Leitrim, where he's lived for the past 30 years, and began with John McGahern himself reading from memoir.
In the corner of the meadow, below Brady's, was a dark, deep quarry. At the railway bridge we turned. An avenue of great trees led up to Ollerton's, and in front of the house was a small lake ringed with reeds, still and clear as a mirror, reflecting the pale moon. When we entered the yard behind the house, we could hear them milking, which they interrupted when they saw us waiting with our cans in the doorway. It was characteristic of my mother that she would have neither coughed nor spoken. By the light of a lantern, milk was strained and measured into our can from a long-handled metal cup. The happiness of that walk and night under the pale moon was so intense that it brought on a lightheadedness. It was as if the whole night, the dark trees, the moon in the small lake, moonlight making pale the gravel of the road we walked, my mother restored to me and giving me her free hand, which I swung heedlessly, were all filled with healing and the certainty that we'd never die. I was safe in her shadow. My chattering at times grew so wild that mother let go of my hand and placed her fingers on my lips in reproof and amusement and love.
When you write your novels, you're writing fiction, how do you stop yourself from embellishing the truth for something like memoir, which is your real life?
I recognise that the two activities were completely different. I don't think you embellish in fiction, but you actually are always trying to improve and invent and pull out of the air. And some people have complained that they recognise that to a certain extent the Shah, in That They May Face the Rising Sun, is based on my uncle, my Uncle Pat, who appears in the memoir, and that he's a much thinner and less interesting person in the memoir than he is in the novel. And of course, in the memoir I had to describe him as he was, but in the fiction I could give him more money, I could give him a bigger house, I could give him a larger opinion of himself and various things like that, which you can't do any of that. I mean, you're just dealing with life. In my experience is that no single person is enough to sustain a fictional character, that it's fed from different sources. And by the end of the novel, he becomes or she becomes a completely different person than the person it was based on or we thought it was. Eventually, they become real figures in your head and they start talking back to you. And in that sense, in fiction, that you're always pulling things out of the air, while in the memoir, everything is under your hand. You're pulling nothing out of the air. You're just remembering and checking what's true. So in that sense, it's a lot quicker and easier. But of course, you have to decide what to leave out. And you have the same difficulty of getting the sentences right and of getting the images right.
How difficult, though, is that? Because
But
you're dealing with real lives and real people. You're having to go back and explore the loss of your mother.
Well, of course, she was the mainstay of my world, and we had a very close relationship, and I was losing my whole world. And I suppose the closest one gets to it in later life is in a disastrous love affair. That first loss, but basically all losses are echoes of that first loss.
Your father is painted in a very unflattering light. You really take no prisoners when you look at your relationship with him and the struggle that you had with him. He was a very tough man and very tough on you children, particularly after the death of your mother.
He was a very strange man, and I mean, I was very happy when I took the memoir, when it was finished but not edited or anything, back to my sisters, who originally brought the letters to me, that to a certain extent caused the memoirs to. And one of the things that pleased me was that they said that I went very easy on my father. And that pleased me because it meant that I think that I didn't judge him.
Was that important to you, to
yes,
not judge him?
Yes, it was, because I actually don't think judging people is useful. A certain sympathy is almost worth a ton of judgments. And that's why my sister's reaction to the book pleased me very much. I mean, my father was an extremely difficult man because he was almost not the same man from minute to minute. It was actually like dealing with Mercury. You know, sometimes he could be very charming, and in the same hour he could be extremely violent.
You certainly returned to him in some shape or fashion through your novels. The first novel, The Barracks, was obviously inspired by the world in which you grew up.
Actually, people think that, but in fact that's not true, is that the rituals of the barracks are all carefully observed. But the sergeant in the barracks is a rather nice man, and he's completely different to my father. I mean, he'd be actually a much more ordinary policeman.
But you wouldn't have gone to the barracks as a setting if you hadn't had that experience,
That's true, and some of the minor characters of the guards would be based, but nearly all the people, and especially Elizabeth, the woman, they're nearly imaginary. I would say that Elizabeth might be an idealist version of myself at the time. But so that I actually had no hesitation in sending my father to the barracks when it was published, because I knew that there was nothing autobiographical in it.
What was his reaction?
I think I printed it in the memoir. I got a very short letter. An old Garda sergeant, I think, sits here with a book and a lamp, hoping that the lamp will flicker or at least show light. Love, Daddy. I think that was the extent of the answer. He had a very good prose style, my father had as well.
So your first novel came out in 1963.
That's right.
And then did you feel that this was something you wanted to do full time, because you were teaching as well? So was there ever any sense that you thought, I could actually do this as a full-time career?
No. I mean, the reason that I went into teaching was that actually I would have enough free time to be a writer. I knew perfectly well that unless I wanted to do journalism, which I didn't, is that there was no way that I could live, that anybody could live at that time after writing. Then
your second novel comes out, The Dark.
I mean, the first novel, I think, won all the prizes that were going at the time and was, a minor success. And of course, the second novel was well publicised for the wrong reasons. I remember being on the Late Show in Belfast, above all places. It was the first time it was from the King's Hall. Gay Byrne was a young compere at the time, and he was asked me about my relationship with the church, and I remember refusing to condemn the church, which I never have, because it was the weather of my early life, and you can never go against the weather of your early life no more than you can go against your own life. And I said that, and somebody stood up in the audience and he said, there's a man banned by the papist government in the south, and who was sacked out of his job by the Archbishop of Dublin. And he comes down here to Belfast and gets up on his hind legs and praises the Catholic Church. Now he says, could Moscow do a better job of brainwashing than that?
It is incredible because you lost your job, you left Ireland, the book is denounced from the pulpit, and yet throughout this there is no sense of bitterness.
I think bitterness is corrosive and it's useless. I mean, that you just accept it as a fact. And I was offered money to protest and to actually take the government to court.
Was it true that Beckett actually gave you some support or offered support?
Yeah, it was a number of people, intellectuals in Paris wanted to, write a circular letter about the book, and they went to Beckett and they asked him would he contribute, and he said quite sensibly that he'd have to read the book first.
And did he?
Apparently he did, and I heard that the answer that he said that it was a good job and that he'd be very happy to sign the letter. But he said that you must ask McGahern first if he wants a protest, and only from Mr. Beckett I would never have been asked. And when they asked me if I wanted a protest, I said I didn't want it, because I said that while I was very grateful to them for wanting to do this, I thought that it would do the whole censorship board and the setup at the time too much honour to protest. We lived a very free life intellectually, because we had both contempt for the church and the state, and we thought that that even an obscene book couldn't be immoral if it was properly written. we would argue. I mean, we were very young, and as you can guess from those statements, quite arrogant, and one didn't expect, as one sees now, to get any kind of rewards like money and things from writing. Writing and reading were a passion for us, and that we do it whether we got paid or whether we got into trouble or anything. And of course, one was much more likely to get into trouble than to be rewarded at the time.
But was this not an opportunity to rail against the dominance of the church and the marriage between church and state in Ireland, and I suppose to be the champion of that? Instead, you decided to say, okay, fair enough, and you left Ireland.
Well, I felt that the only responsibility I had was to my trade. And I did remark that if I had spent more time writing the doc, I'd wrote it very quickly, the church and the censorship board mightn't have noticed it.
So you were criticising your own book then?
I did say that, but it shows you how little I cared about them. But it was unpleasant, not for me because I was abroad, but I remember my sisters going to weddings and being pointed out as the sisters of the fellow that wrote the dirty book.
But have you ever had a chance to talk to anybody from that time? Maybe not so much somebody who denounced you from the pulpit, but at least to get an idea of why they were so against you. Was it fear? Was it the sense of you were actually exposing a chink in their armour, that the sense of a flock just faithfully following them was actually beginning to splinter?
I think that it's very complicated. I mean, especially the people around here where I've lived for a very long time and where I grew up. Really their allegiance to the church wasn't all that deep, and they hadn't all that great respect for either church or state. In that sense, they were very like the intellectuals that I used to hang about in Dublin, because they knew that if they couldn't win a living off these poor fields, that they'd have to go to England, and neither church nor state would help them. And I think that Ireland is a very complicated place, that it never had any kind of true cohesion, and the individual and the locality was always much more powerful than the institutional church or the state, and that a lot of what was thundered and was listened to was only given lip service. I remember a dear old friend of mine used to describe what the church had to do on a Sunday as that owl performance. Isn't what you'd call a very supine view of Rome.
Do you think that kind of attitude has a lot to do with the physical makeup of Leitrim as I was coming down here today. It's a place that is at once beautiful, but then when you look below the surface, you know that the soil is poor. On a day like today, the sun is shining, but you can only imagine just how harsh it must be on a winter's day.
I mean, that's, not so true anymore, but really people we knew when we came here first used to fear the winter because they equated the dark nights with depression. How to put around the time until the long days came again was a constant theme.
And is that possibly where your love of storytelling and writing comes from, that putting in of the dark days?
I don't think so. I think that my writing came from reading, and that I mentioned in the memoir that when I was 10 or 11, I had great good luck. I was given the run of a library, and without that library, I would never have become a writer. The Moronys should have been wealthy. They had to have money to build the big stone house in the first place, to build and slate the stone houses that enclosed the farmyard, to acquire the hundreds of books that lined the walls of the library. They were beautiful, gentle, impractical men. They lived for the most part on tea and bread and honey, and now and again made a big stew. They had an unusual method of housekeeping. There was much cutlery, glass, cups, plates from the days when the house had entertained. They would continue using them until they were all dirty, and then every month or so, father and son would do a big washing up and start all over again. They gathered apples, stored them on wooden benches on the stone outhouses, sold them by the bucketful, and seemed glad of the half-crowns they received. I was sent to buy apples, fell into conversation with Willie about books, and was given the run of the library. There were Scott Dickens' popular romances, Meredith, Shakespeare, books by Zane Grey and Geoffrey Farnell, and many, many books about the Rocky Mountains. Some person in that 19th century house must have been fascinated by the Rocky Mountains. I picked the books with nothing but pleasure in mind and read them the way a boy now might watch countless TV dramas. Every week or fortnight for years, I'd return with 5 or 6 books in my oilcloth shopping bag and take 5 or 6 away. Nobody gave me direction or advice.
How did you go from being such an avid reader of books to becoming a writer?
I remember it very well. That I was good at school, so to a certain extent, though we had no money, and especially no encouragement from my father, I could almost have become anything, a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor. And I remember thinking, it actually got to do with my upbringing in religion. There's that the world to come, heaven and hell, and purgatory were far more real to us than the world we're living in, which I think is, from what the point of view I am at now, was a very precarious and dangerous way to think and live. But when the reality of the fictional worlds that I lived in Moroney's books, in a way became as real as heaven and hell was for me when I was a very small child, I thought that if a writer can create all these people, doctors, teachers, sailors, soldiers, what's the point in becoming any of them if you can create the whole lot of them?
So what's the process then? Do you sit down and have a routine every day that you sit at your desk?
Well, it's the mysterious activity, and it's almost reluctant to talk about because I don't fully understand it, is that I've never written anything that wasn't in my head for a year or many years, and that it seems that whatever it is won't go away until it's written down. And sometimes when it's written down that you realise after maybe 4 or 5 months, sometimes as long as that, sometimes after a week or two, that there was nothing serious about this thing that was obsessing you for a long time, and that it disappears. And other times it grows into work. But in that sense is that you never know until you see what's there, whether, for instance, it's a short story or a novel. And if it's a short story, it'll assert itself very quickly because a short work is much more dramatic. It has a different rhythm than a novel. I mean, in fact, that the rhythm of a story will be too intense, it will be tiresome over the whole length of a novel. And then other times that you realise it's a novel, and then you know that you're in big trouble, that the next 4 or 5 or 6 years are gone wallop. And then you have to, and then you have to work every day. But I never worked for more than 2 hours, and I found that it wasn't very useful if I worked more than 2 hours, because it's almost like it's a kind of physical, you're tired after it. And that you could do other work like journalism or criticism or reviewing, but that's a different order of work. And then I find that you're much more useful thinking about what you'll write the next day than, say, attempting to write in the afternoon.
And do you write longhand? Or
yes, I write all the time. And then at a certain stage, but it's a late stage, it's put on a computer. And it's actually much easier to edit it on a computer, but the real work is done at that stage, because then it becomes as if you're looking at the work by somebody else. For instance, Amongst Women was about 5 or 6 times longer than the original novel. And I remember when the man that dramatised it for the BBC television series rang me up and he complained that somebody at the BBC said there wasn't enough violence and sex in it. And I was able to give him plenty of violence and sex that I had removed from the text.
So you'd edited yourself?
Yes.
Denounced yourself from
I
your own
edited that dirty stuff out.
I suppose for people who read your novels, they may wonder, where do you actually physically sit? What are you looking at? What are you listening to whenever you're writing a novel?
That's very simple. I drink as many cups of tea as possible in order to avoid going to the room.
Displacement therapy. Yeah.
And then when I go to the room, sometimes I spend some time looking out the window, but the door is shut. That's the important thing. So when you have nothing but yourself, it's surprising what you get up to, rather than continue looking out the window. And very soon I'd start writing. I mean, I'm half joking.
Do you listen to music?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I also face a wall, so that I'm not tempted to look at anything except what's under my nose, what I'm writing.
And anything on that wall?
No, there's nothing on the wall. It's just a white wall and a table and a chair. And you just work. And sometimes, and it's very rare, is that the work goes on longer than you imagined, that it takes you over. And it's a very strange sort of happiness, but it's very rare. It only happens maybe every year or 2 years for one day, is that you think that you're writing for 2 or 3 minutes, and then suddenly you realise that 3 or 4 hours have gone by and you have been completely oblivious. And I had that same experience when I was first reading as a child.
There's a lovely image of you with your sisters being quite mischievous whenever you were reading as a child, and you looked up and they had tied your shoelaces together and put a straw hat on your head.
They used to remember that I was lost in a book in that phrase, and they must have been amused by the way I was lost, and they tied my shoelaces and they put a straw hat on my head, and only when they moved the chair away from the light did I notice them, and woke to find them all in stitches laughing around me. And it's only the only time I can recover that complete sense of happiness or loss of time, sense of time, is very now and again when I'm writing, and very seldom. But it does happen.
And do you write in this house?
Yes, I have been able to take work with me. When I may travel abroad or something, and that I could write in hotels, but I would never be able to start work there. I mean, it would be like rewriting a revision or something like that.
So it is this place that we have to come back to then when we talk about your work. It is this house which you've been living in for 30 years. It is Leitrim. It is this part of the world in which you grew up.
Well, that's actually because that's where I live. But I mean, I wrote my first 2 books in Dublin, and the room in Dublin was exactly the same as the room I have in Leitrim. And if I was in London, I was beginning to write. I mean, I hadn't written for the longest time, when I got sacked that time, I moved to London. My life was very disturbed, and I didn't write for, I think, about 3 years, and that's the longest time I never wrote for. And I wasn't a bit bothered because, one is at the mercy of whatever mysterious process writing is part of. It's often called the muses or whatever it is. And if it goes away, it's gone and there's nothing you can do about it. And when it comes back, all you can do is serve it and write as well as you can.
You would imagine that you being from here, from this part of the world, that it would be you wanting to come back and live in your home again. But it was in fact your wife, Madeline, who's from New York, fell in love with the place.
Well, I wouldn't say fell in love with it, but you never get reruns at life. It was what happened. I would have been happy at that time to have gone anywhere. People think that I came back to my roots, but it was actually Madeline liked this place and wanted to live here. But if she hadn't liked it, we were young enough to have moved anywhere, and we would have moved anywhere. And then it becomes your life. Like sometimes you go to a dance just casually and you meet somebody that becomes your life. And sometimes you're looking for a house and you don't think about it in the morning, but that becomes your house for the next 30 years.
Were you reluctant at all to come back to a place that I suppose did have unhappy memories?
It hadn't really unhappy memories for me. It was just where a great deal of my life happened. And I knew the speech and the people like my own breathing. So, one of the things that I found very pleasant about living abroad, which I have been to America, many places, is that you never feel responsible for anything that's going on, which is a great feeling. But you never really feel involved because it's only in the place that you're from that you really know the nuances. And what's unsaid in speech is often far more important than the things that are said.
When you look back on your body of work, do you find yourself ever rereading your own work? Do you ever look back on it, or once it's done, is that it over?
Only when I have to, for some reason or other.
And do you look at it and think, I could have written that better, or I was young then?
Was a friend of mine who used to work on the BBC called Julian Jem, and he was a grandson of Hilaire Belloc. And he has a wonderful picture of his grandfather reading in his own library. He read aloud in the library his own collected works, aloud to himself, and all that the children could hear was, "Splendid, this man can write," but it wouldn't be encouraged in Leitrim. In the sense of reading your own work.
How does it make you feel when you read criticisms of yourself or people describing you as Ireland's greatest living novelist?
One doesn't think much about those. I think it's a great honour to be read. And I haven't much sympathy with the romantic notion of the artist, and I think it did a lot of damage. My position, I would much prefer to be talked as a tradesman, that I work in a trade, and that I think that a book doesn't come alive again until it's read. What is a book but a jumble of words stuck between covers? And it comes alive in the reader's mind.
But it's a jumble of words, John, but it's the way that you as John McGahern have shaped those jumble of words. I think you're maybe being a little bit self-deprecating here about the power of your writing.
I think that's not for me to say, that actually when the book is done, it belongs to my readers, if the book is lucky enough to find readers. And if it doesn't find readers, it's gone. There's a very nice thing that Chekhov said about that. He says, when a writer takes a pen into his or her hand, they accuse themselves of unanswerable egotism. And all they can do with decency after that is to bow. And I think that's quite sensible, because it is an enormous kind of conceit or self-confidence or whatever you call it, to imagine that what you write is going to be of interest to somebody else and that they're going to buy it and spend part of their lives reading it. So I think that all you can do is bow and feel honoured. And I believe that passionately.
And that's it from tonight's Arts Extra. My thanks to John McGahern. From producer Stan Ferguson and me, Marie-Louise Kerr, good night.